All right, happy Wednesday, sixth graders. Yesterday, we talked about how businesses were starting up and expanding quickly in the United States. Remember, we had those three things, right? We had resources, the ability to actually find things that people want to either make other things with or to just sell them. You need people, like to actually do the work. And then you need capital, which is kind of a fancy term. There's other things involved, but mainly it primarily revolves around money and the ability to expand your business. Okay. Now, at this time in particular, today, it's a little bit different. But in those times in particular, really the most important thing when it came to having a successful business, if it wasn't making a process better from selling an existing product, like we'll talk about later on this week with JD Rockefeller and oil, you're going to need to find something new, right? A new product that people are really going to want to spend a lot of time and money into learning how to use it. And the United States ends up becoming a huge proprietor of people that are coming up with these brand new inventions based on a lot of new demands. And as we're going to see today, I think there's really two people that your book kind of discusses. The first, it really goes into depth with Thomas Edison and his invention of, well, a lot of things, but the light bulb in particular, right? And the light bulb is something that comes in demand from a lot of people that are working either near each other or living near each other, and they want to illuminate an area at any time of the day. And I think had you not brought all these people together in this industrialized society, probably wouldn't have happened, right? There really wouldn't have been much of a use for it. It's the idea of people coming together in these environments that creates that demand or that want. The second person that we're going to talk about, and I actually want to go into depth on this video, is Alexander Graham Bell, who he's known for arguably, especially if you think about us today, probably the most important invention with what it's led to that we use commonly in the United States. But we'll get to that in just a bit. So let's hop into it. Share screen. Oh, it's getting near lunchtime. My stomach just rumbled. Okay. So for today, we've got a reading guide that's going to be due on Friday. On Friday, you're going to get another one, and we'll obviously talk about that then, but you're going to turn that in with the next week's material as opposed to turning it in with this packet. Okay, but we'll get back to that. Your warm-up for today is, how many creations do you think Thomas Edison and his company came up with during his life? And it's a multiple choice question. If I remember, which I think I will, I'll give you the answer tomorrow. Just give me a guess. What do you think? You got 4 responses. So for Graham Bell, first of all, I think he's got one of the coolest hairdos / beards I've ever seen for an old man. But originally, he's born in the northern British country of Scotland, and he grows up with quite a bit of privilege, especially considering that his father was a college professor. Now, he was a traveling professor, but he primarily focused on the idea of what's called visible speech. And what it really centered around was the idea of communications with people that are deaf. And he was hoping that in his lifetime, his father hoped that people would lose the traditional method of signing between deaf people communicating and transitioning to lip reading. And he thought that it would be easier for people that do speak to understand. And he also thought that the method of sign language was difficult because then it would force people that were able to speak to learn the language in order to communicate, right? Now, this is very controversial. In fact, a lot of people actually really dislike him because they think that he's not being very sensitive to the demands and the needs of people that are deaf. But at the time, it was still very popular and a lot of people discussed it. So Alexander Graham Bell, his son, they're not the same age. These are probably around the same time of their life. He grows up and he is around people that are deaf and tries to communicate with them quite a bit. And the idea of speech and sound is something that greatly intrigues him. In fact, even through not really reading music, but just by going off of sound, he's able to become a great piano player as a very, very young boy simply by listening to the pitch and the rhythm and the tone. But then he also starts doing scientific experiments. And he lives near a sheep farm, which is very common in Scotland to this day, actually. And he had a best friend who was around his age, and his parents owned a sheep farm. Now, I'm not going to get into too many specifics with it because it's a little bit weird, but you have to remember, if you're raising sheep, not only are you raising wool, but you're also going to be creating meat. And through that process, they were able to get their hands on things of sheep that they could experiment with sound. And the number one thing is their voice box. And he was able to try to replicate sounds coming out of a sheep's voice box by pushing pressurized air with a bellows into it. And he realized how changes in pitch occur by how much the larynx or that voice box vibrates. This is when he was like 9, right? Like, I'm in my 20s right now, and that sounds like kind of a gross yet interesting experiment. And I don't think I could pull that off. This is a prodigy, right? He clearly is very, very, very skilled. And unlike some other prodigies that don't get the opportunity, because of his father's stature, he is definitely going to be able to get an opportunity to show that sort of potential, right? Now, what ends up happening is that he has 2 siblings that die of tuberculosis, which is weird because that goes from the lungs to make the voice box to make sound, right? So he loses 2 siblings to tuberculosis very young. His father gets very, very, very sick because they're living in urban environments. Most notably, they're living in London for a while. And London was very, very dirty at the time. There wasn't very good sanitation practices. So what ends up happening is they start moving to different places in the British Empire. Okay, so they move around a little bit, and then they end up settling in Canada. Now, Alex's health was getting very bad too. In fact, a lot of people thought he had tuberculosis and were worried that he was going to die. It turns out it was just a respiratory infection, and he ended up making a full recovery. And as you can very clearly tell, he lives to a ripe old age. So thankfully for them that he ended up doing that. Now, Alex is going to spend a lot of time working with the deaf, right? And I think you want to think about your exit ticket. I think a lot of it has to do with his background, right? In fact, he actually ends up marrying a woman who is deaf, and she is a lip reader, which is what he primarily wanted to focus on, kind of taking up his father's mantle. But after a while, the United States starts to expand later on in his life in like the 1870s. And well, that's when his invention came out, but later on as well. And the desire to communicate effectively became a very big demand because of how wide and far the United States was across, right? Great Britain is a tiny island. The United States is like 100 times the size of it. And that's just an estimation on my part. I might even be lowballing it. So in order to get a patent that to make something that would be very efficient to communicate, he would become a very, very, very rich man. Now, the current technology at that time was what was called a telegraph, and it was created by a guy named Samuel Morse. And the idea is that you take your finger and you tap down in certain patterns on this little device, and when it does, it sets out a tone. Now, if you know the language in a series of anywhere between 1 to 4 tones, whether it's a short tone or a long tone, the telegraph can make out letter by letter words that you can translate into sentences. And it goes through like modern telephone poles, right? They're called telegraph poles, but it's the same sort of idea. Now, there's a couple problems with that. Number one, you have to be very well educated in it. And to do each letter, each tone is about 3 seconds long. That's a very long time. For me to take 12 seconds to come out with one word, that's pretty excessive, right? So Graham Bell decides that through his scientific knowledge, he's going to come up with something that he can directly speak into that will do the same thing, but it's going to instantaneously take his speech and go into another receiver. Now, the nice thing is, as long as you know the English language and you have the ability to hear, you're going to be able to understand that. You don't have to have a specific education in what's called Morse code. Now, eventually, although he barely gets this patent out, and you're going to learn about patents in your reading today, but basically it means the sole ability to create and continue to produce an invention. This telephone is going to give birth to what's called the AT&T Broadcasting or Telecommunications Company, which to this day is going to be one of the most wealthy communications companies in the world. In fact, Dallas Cowboys Stadium is AT&T Stadium, and that's the biggest football stadium of them all. So you can tell that's clearly a wealthy company. But I think the main thing is now we think about how I've got this telephone right here that I can call my parents at any time in a different state, not have to pay a single cent. And as long as they're sitting near their phone and they see it's ringing, they can pick it up. Okay. At this time, it was very primitive. It was hard to hear them. And in fact, there's a YouTube video that you can watch. It's a minute long, and you can actually hear his voice through the very first telephone call. And you're going to hear how grainy and difficult it is to hear. But you got to remember, we got to start somewhere, right? And I think it's important to realize that this came from a demand, right? The United States is expanding. People like Graham Bell realize this. They have passions in a certain area, and they're going to translate that into making an invention that's going to make a whole bunch of money, okay? Edison does the same thing with the light bulb, and we're going to see this all over the United States. It's the incentive to make money and to get these patents that secure just one specific type of production that's going to push people to want to continue to invent. When you do, you get these great inventions, you get companies and factories that build them, you get people that have jobs creating them, and voila, you have got a very, very, very strong economy booming with all new types of businesses. And then you got trains to transport them places that want to buy them. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you now. Make sure that you get your exit ticket done. Watch that video on Graham Bell and his voice. It's pretty cool, and it's really short. But your reading guide will be due on Friday. And tomorrow we are going to go through a little extra credit assignment. All right. Have yourselves a good night. We'll see you tomorrow.